Hello, welcome everybody. Many of you will know me already. I'm Martin Jonas. I'm a physicist by background, and I've been with Brooks Bell since 1998 as a cargo scientist, a commodity expert, and I'm currently the Director of Science for the UK operations. Today I'm going to talk about the Imsbc code, which, as most of you will already know, is the primary IMO instrument for the regulation of the carriage of cargoes in bulk, other than grain. Adam, can you switch us to the slideshow? There we are. You should now all see the title slide. My apologies. The more eagle-eyed of you will notice this is not a bulk carrier. It's the standard Brooks Bell presentation slide, and it's a container ship. So today there's three sections, as Adam has said. The first one is quite short. I want to place the Imsbc code into the context of SOLAS in general and the other IMO cargo codes, and then move on to discussing how the Imsbc code actually works, because it's quite different from other IMO cargo codes, and it has a specific structure and a specific internal logic which is designed to help shippers and carriers and masters to identify the cargo hazards of the cargo. And many regular users of the Imsbc code may not be familiar with that internal logic, but it helps a lot to understand it in order to get more out of using it. And then, as Adam said, we're going to do a quick Q&A session after this. It's a natural break point, and then move on to specifically discussing how the Imsbc code works with cargo fire and explosion hazards, which then helps to illustrate the concepts I've introduced in the first half. So, SOLAS, the International Convention for Safety at Life at Sea, has two sections that deal with cargoes in general, which is Chapter 6, Carriage of Cargoes and Oil Fuels, and Chapter 7, Dangerous Goods. And in this context, and that becomes important throughout the talk, I'm going to illustrate that more, dangerous goods has a very specific technical definition, which may not be the same definition as in other and more legal context. This is dangerous goods. For this purpose are substances, materials, and articles classified under the provisions of the harmonized UN manual tests and criteria. So each cargo that is a dangerous good has a UN number and at least one hazard class. Class 1 explosives to class 9 miscellaneous hazards. And that excludes quite a large number of bulk cargoes that we would generally consider to be hazardous. And I'll get to how it deals with this later. Now, these are the chapter headings, the regulations included in Chapter 6 and 7. Don't try to read all of them. I'll highlight the relevant ones here in red now. And these are, in each of these sections, you have a requirement for a carriage of certain types of cargoes. And in the original SOLAS versions from 74 and thereafter, these were quite long. In particular here, Regulation 1.2 and Regulation A175 here were many pages each. And over time, IMO has farmed all of those regulations and read out into these separate codes, which means that the current version of SOLAS reads like this. These are complete quotes, the entirety of those highlighted red regulations. And that gives you a total of 6 IMO cargo codes, each of them replacing one of these regulations, which are these 6. The Imsbc code, the International Grain Code, the IMDG code, the IBC code, the IGC code, and the INF code. Now, one thing you may notice here already is that the Imsbc code appears twice. And that's a pointer to a very specific feature of the Imsbc code, in that, unlike all the other codes here, it covers both dangerous and non-hazardous cargoes. So, moving on to Imsbc code here, the Imsbc code specifically was introduced under SOLAS at the beginning of 2011, It gets revised roughly every 2 years. So the current edition is the 2020 edition, which replaced the 2018 edition on the 1st of January of this year in mandatory form. And whereas the IMDG code only covers dangerous goods, packaged dangerous goods, the Imsbc code covers all solid bulk cargoes except grain. So that includes dangerous goods in bulk. These are, as I said before, the cargoes with a UN number within hazard classes 1 to 9. Materials hazardous only in bulk. These are cargoes that would be non-hazardous if you package them in bagged or containerized, but if you carry them in bulk on a bulk carrier or on any other ship for the matter in bulk, they are hazardous and subject to specific regulations under the Imsbc code to deal with those hazards. Then it covers cargoes that can liquefy, which are Group A cargoes. That's a hazard that only exists in bulk because cargo liquefaction is inherently a bulk hazard. And then it also covers, and that's an important point, everything else. All cargoes that are covered in bulk are in the Imsbc code and are regulated by the Imsbc code, even if they're non-hazardous. And those are generally called Group C. I'll get later to what these groups mean. So the Imsbc code, how is it organized? That's the current edition, and it consists of these particular sections. And as you can see, the large bulk of this book, pages 59 to 394, is made up of Appendix 1. That is a long list of individual cargoes. Each cargo in the code has at least one page, sometimes many pages for the more complex ones, with an individual cargo schedule organized alphabetically by cargo name. And so a lot of users of the Imsbc code will go straight to that Appendix 1, to the individual cargo schedule, and will never look at anything else. But a lot of general regulations that apply to all bulk cargoes are actually in the first 58 pages, which are section 1 to 13 of the code. And I will talk specifically in this talk about section 1, which are special permits and exemptions. Section 4, which is the cargo information required by shippers, so cargo declaration and associated documents. I will not talk about cargoes that can liquefy in any great detail, but it's important to appreciate that almost all the regulations that are relevant for cargoes that can liquefy Group A cargoes are actually in this first section, in sections 4 to 7 to 8, because they apply to a whole range of different cargoes and not to the specifics. So they've all been farmed out into this individual one. And then we have laboratory tests, a catch-all very brief appendix, and an index in the code. So to start with, probably go to what most people start with, which is a typical cargo schedule. This is a typical cargo schedule. It's one of the more innocuous cargoes in the code. It's ferrochrome, which is basically just very heavy, very dense chunks of metal. The only hazard is don't drop it on your tank top, it will dent it. But we can look at it to specific elements that every single schedule in the Imsbc code has. And that is, first of all, the bulk cargo shipping name, BCSN, which is the central concept of the code for identifying cargo hazard. Every single cargo has an assigned bulk cargo shipping name and only one specific name. And it's always, this is a convention in the code, it's never spelled out, but it carries as a thread through the entire code. It's spelled out in all capitals. So whenever you see a cargo name written in all capitals in the Imsbc code, it means this is a bulk cargo shipping name. And then it has the cargo group, which in this case is Group C, which is non-hazardous. It's not very much more to say, but to this particular schedule, it's, as I said, quite an innocuous cargo. This one is a bit less innocuous. This is sulfur. Now, in this instance, we still have the bulk cargo shipping name up here. And now you see that there's a UN number behind it, UN 1350. That means this is a dangerous good. It would also be dangerous if you ship it in packaged form, and then it would be regulated under the IMDG code. Accordingly, it has UN hazard class, which is 4.1, flammable goods. It has a cargo group, it's now Group B. Group B is cargoes that possess a chemical hazard. Now, in addition to dangerous goods and non-hazardous goods, I showed you before there is a third type of hazard, and that is MHB, material hazard only in bulk. Example here would be ferrosilicon if it has less than 30% silicon. You see there's still a bulk cargo shipping name, it's still in all capitals, there's no UN number, there's no hazard class, only the indication MHB, but it's still group B, material hazard, with chemical hazards. So this is sort of the in-between bit of hazardous cargoes that are regulated only under the Imsbc code. And then we have, as I said before, cargoes that can liquefy, group A. The standard schedule for that is the mineral concentrates schedule, but there are a number of other group A cargoes that with individual bulk cargo shipping names that are also group A cargoes. This particular schedule has a unique property, which is that it covers a large number of different bulk cargo shipping names. You can see here there are about 20 or so individual bulk cargo shipping name, whereas mineral concentrates up here is not written in all capitals. That is not bulk cargo shipping name. So the bulk cargo shipping name are all these individual ones, but they all refer to the same schedule, namely the mineral concentrates, and it's a group A schedule, which means that that is cargoes that can liquefy. So taking those cargo groups out, these are the cargo groups, which are group A, cargoes which may liquefy or undergo dynamic separation under the new schedules, which are mineral concentrates mainly and a number of other ones. Then we have group B, which are cargoes that possess a chemical hazard. I've showed you the ferrosilicon schedule for that. Seed cake is another one of those. Sulfur is also one of them. Some cargoes may have both group A and group B hazards. Those are cargoes which may liquefy and also possess chemical hazards. That includes the metal sulfide concentrates, that's copper concentrate, zinc concentrate, lead concentrate, also fluorspars, under certain circumstances, also coal. And then we have everything else, which is group C, cargoes which are neither liable to liquefy nor possess chemical hazards, but are still regulated under the Imsbc code. And then once you know what you're carrying, the individual schedule for that cargo plus sections 1 to 13 give the details of the hazards and the carriage requirements for that particular cargo. Now, I said before, the central concept of the code is the BCSN, the bulk cargo shipping name. And I'll talk you through how that works, how you get to the schedule from the bulk cargo shipping name. The shipper is obliged to give the master prior to loading or the owners a cargo declaration. And that must include a number of elements, and some of them are the bulk cargo shipping name and the cargo group. The form reproduced in the Imsbc code is this one. I should emphasize this is not a mandatory form. It can be, the cargo declaration can be provided in any form whatsoever, but it has to be in writing or electronic transmission, not verbally. But this is the form reproduced in the code, and most shippers use it. And you see here it has a very wide field at the top, which is the bulk cargo shipping name BCSN. Quite a few shippers think this is some sort of header or title, and don't put anything into this wide field. Instead, put the cargo name down here into general description of the cargo. That is wrong. The bulk cargo shipping name needs to appear up here, and then if there's a trade name or a bill of lading description or the like, that goes in there. But the bulk cargo shipping name must be there. And then the cargo group is here at either group A and B, group A, B, or C. Once you have the bulk cargo shipping name, you can go to the index of the Imsbc code, which is here, and you will find alphabetically all the bulk cargo shipping name as before in all capitals. And you'll find the cargo group, and if it's in the index in all capitals, there will be an individual schedule. If it's in the index but in lowercase, then there will be a cross-reference to a bulk cargo shipping name and that schedule. So here, for example, soybean expelled, soybean extracted gets referred to the seed cake schedule. There are a lot of individual cargo names. There are also two what I call umbrella schedules, which are the mineral concentrate schedule and the seed cake schedule. IMO in their wisdom have decided to deal with those two schedules in precisely the opposite way. As I said before, the mineral concentrate schedule covers 20 or so individual bulk cargo shipping names, but the bulk cargo shipping name is the individual cargo name, whereas in the seed cake schedule is the other way around. There are many, many different seed cakes, but none of them are bulk cargo shipping names. Soybean meal, for example, is not a bulk cargo shipping name. Bulk cargo shipping name is seed cake, and it's always seed cake. Once you have this, there are three options. First of all, the bulk cargo shipping name the shipper has given you exists, is in the code. You look it up, you carry the cargo in accordance with that schedule. That's relatively straightforward. It may also be the case that shippers have given you a name that is not listed in the code, or that doesn't have a bulk cargo shipping name at all, in which case this is a big red warning sign. Do not load this cargo. But if the bulk cargo shipping name is not listed in the code, then this cargo can only be loaded with a specific competent authority permit. And it's section 1.3 of the Imsbc code that deals with this. So these are generally called section 1.3 permits. In a diagram like this, if you have a green and a red, you can probably imagine there's probably going to be a yellow sign as well, and that is section 1.5. You may have a listed bulk cargo shipping name, but shippers tell you that their particular cargo does not have the hazards or properties assigned to it in the Imsbc code. They can do that, but they can't do that off their own bat. That has to be approved by the competent authority of the exporting country. And that is under provisions in section 1.5. So it's a competent authority exemption. There aren't actually that many section 1.3 and section 1.5 certificates around. So it might be helpful if I show you an example. It may not look like that. Different competent authorities may do them differently. This is one from 2010, issued by the US Coast Guard, and it's a cargo authorization under section 1.3 of the Imsbc code for a cargo which was then not listed in the Imsbc code, distillers dried grain with solubles. And if you flick down this letter, you will see that it assigns it a new bulk cargo shipping name, namely distillers dried grain with solubles. It says it's a Group C cargo, and that particular permit exemption is valid until 2013. The code provides that any competent authority issuing one of these letters must make within a year submission to IMO, with the idea that they will then introduce it in the next edition of the Imsbc code as a new schedule. And indeed, ever since 2013, the Imsbc code has had a schedule for distilled dried grain with solubles. So that is how the mechanism is meant to work, section 1.3. Section 1.5, again, this is the US Coast Guard. This is actually a very similar cargo to DDGS. This is another seed cake type cargo. In this case, it's corn gluten feed, also a maize-based byproduct of the distilling industry. But this letter says it's section 1.5, and it does not change the bulk cargo shipping name. It's still seed cake, but they consider, the US Coast Guard considered that corn gluten feed does not have the hazards assigned then to seed cake cargoes, so it exempted it from certain provisions of that schedule. And again, a submission to IMO was made, a new schedule was introduced, and since the 2014 edition, I think, 15 edition of the code, corn gluten feed was one of the seed cake cargoes that could be non-hazardous under certain conditions. So that is how the mechanism for section 1.3 and section 1.5 is meant to work. And that means that the framework of the Imsbc code looks like this. For every BCSN listed in the code, you have a cargo group, they have the hazard, you have the carriage requirement, and they are listed in the schedule. And the only bodies that can assign a BCSN or a cargo group are either IMO or the competent authority of the country of loading. But this is not the job of an individual shipper. It's not the job of the individual ship owner to assign. It's not the job of cargo experts either. So if a cargo is offered for loading, even if it appears obviously non-hazard to everybody involved, it still needs a section 1.3 certificate unless it's already listed in the code. In principle, that should prevent disputes on cargo hazard identification. It's in the code, you're fine. If it's not in the code, then you go to the competent authority. Unfortunately, in practice, it's never quite as smooth as that. Disputes are fairly common, and various reasons. One of them is that Not all the schedules in the code are quite as unambiguous or consistent as one might hope for. So there are disputes about how it's to interpret it, especially when it comes to exemptions. Some shippers either knowingly or unknowingly misrepresent cargoes. So they give them that say it's one type of cargo which is listed when in fact it's not listed, or the other way around. Some shippers, or some ship owners and masters for that matter, may not know what the Imsbc code requires. Sometimes shippers want to do the right thing, but the competent authority simply doesn't get involved or doesn't issue a certificate that they have to issue. Sometimes competent authorities become involved, but in an inappropriate way, in a way that's not consistent with the principles of maritime safety. And one particular problem is that while the code tells you how each individual bulk cargo shipping name shall be carried, it does not tell you then, if you have a commodity at hand, how you actually go about deciding what is the bulk cargo shipping name for that particular commodity. A few brief examples. I won't go into great details here. There are some cargoes that are listed in the code that can have multiple groups with certain criteria of which group any particular cargo has. And there are ammonium nitrate fertilizers. I'm going to talk about them in the section on fire and explosion hazards. Coal, coal is always group B, but some coals can also liquefy. Mineral concentrates, they're always group A, but some types of mineral concentrate, the sulfide concentrates, are also group B because they can emit toxic gases and self-heat. And seed cake, again, I'm coming to that, can be either group B, a chemical hazard, or group C, non-hazardous, depending on certain criteria. So those criteria sometimes give problems how they're to be interpreted. Then there are some cargoes that are listed as group C, but that can actually be hazardous. And that shouldn't, of course, happen. The whole idea of having a bulk cargo shipping name that corresponds to group C is it's non-hazardous. And IMO, to give them credit, are gradually working their way, usually in response to casualties happening, and is eliminating them one by one. I haven't quite managed to eliminate them all. High-profile ones were iron ore, which until 2016 was only a Group C cargo. In 2016, the new schedule for iron ore fines was introduced, same with manganese ore fines. More recently, in the 2020 edition, bauxite had a new schedule called bauxite fines, so that now can also be a Group A cargo. Each of these was in response to high-profile sinkings, the bulk Jupiter in the case of bauxite. Unfortunately, there are a few others that still have the same problem, which are barytes, for example, chromite ore, and sand cargoes. Show some examples here. This is bauxite on the left. Bauxite, an obvious group C cargo that will never liquefy whatever the moisture content. This is also bauxite, but it's immediately obviously a Group A cargo. In fact, in this case, a very wet Group A cargo. To recognize that these two cargoes have a very different hazards, since the 2020 edition, mandatory since the 1st of January this year, there's a new schedule called bauxite fines. However, this, for example, barytes, is still only one BCSN, which is barytes in the Group C schedule, but this is a Group C cargo. This one is a Group A cargo. It's also called barite concentrate, but that's not in the code either. And it's very, very similar to fluorspar, and it has actually sunk at least one vessel back in the 1980s. Similarly, chrome concentrate, chromite ore, the bulk cargo ship name is chromite ore. The schedule says chromite ore covers concentrates or lump cargoes, but as chrome concentrates, it's very definitely Group A cargo. And I've been personally on at least 2 ships where this cargo liquefied and shifted. This is one of them. But that's not recognized in the code, and that gives rise to disputes quite frequently. And sometimes cargoes are simply are shipped in hazardous form through freak coincidences. This is ferrous sulfate heptahydrate, which is listed as a Group C cargo in the code. But in this particular instance, the shipper decided to do a slight change in their manufacturing parameters in response to market conditions, and it results in their sulfuric acid recovery being less than normal. And this ship had to pull into Falmouth as a port of refuge on the way from Spain to northern England, with a 10-degree list, which you can see here in this photo, flattened out, and with a lot of free liquid on top, which everybody initially thought was water coming in, but when it's analyzed, this is actually 40% concentrated sulfuric acid, which is very definitely not a Group C cargo, but the only schedule listed in the code is as a Group C cargo. So freak occurrences do happen. This is a bit less freak occurrence and more deception. Quite frequently, shippers of cargoes that are listed as hazardous will simply say my cargo is non-hazardous. It happens a lot with DRI-C cargoes, which are DRI fines. Fortunately, less so now. It used to happen a lot with iron ore fines, but by now that's high enough profile that virtually all shippers of iron ore fines actually declare their cargoes as Group A. And we do see it quite frequently with seed K cargoes that are not covered by the exemptions for non-hazardous cargoes, but are declared as Group C nevertheless. Then you have a category of cargoes that are not actually listed at all, and therefore need a Section 1.3 certificate, but are simply sort of force-fitted into one of the existing BCSNs. And there's a very wide category here, which are called post-industrial tailings, which are basically finely divided mineral cargoes that are sold as if they were, for example, iron ore fines or zinc concentrate, because they have high iron or zinc content, but actually have a completely different history, are not mined materials at all. And they should not be shipped as iron ore fines or as concentrate or any of the existing, because they will all have very individual hazards, and really they need a one-by-one individual assessment, and therefore Section 1.3 certificate. I've touched on sand before. It's a very big business in the Far East for land reclamation mainly, and it's universally declared with the BCSN sand as Group C and Group C. The code is not very clear what it means by sand, but on my reading of that schedule, it would only be applied to very dry industrial sands, and everything that's dredged really need an individual assessment of whether it's Group A or Group C, because some drain quick enough not to liquefy and some don't drain quick enough. And then we have things like mill scale, which used to be shipped very widely as iron concentrate or iron ore fines. There is now a new schedule, well, no longer that new, 2016, which is scale generated from the iron and steel making process. So it does have a BCSN now, but many shippers are still saying it's mill scale and don't use that new schedule. And then the opposite happens as well. Cargoes that are actually regulated and listed are declared by shippers without reference to that bulk cargo shipping name, either because they don't know it or because they don't want to follow the regulations that are in that particular schedule. It happens with some seed cargo with concentrates, and as I said before, it happens with mill scale quite frequently. And then you also get cargoes that are not listed at all, and that are shipped out anyway without any attempt of identifying a bulk cargo shipping name. And these cargoes are really shipped entirely illegally and outside the IMSBC code, because you must have a bulk cargo shipping name or Section 1.3 certificates. Interestingly, this includes, for at least a 2-year period, nickel ore, because it only became listed in the code in 2013. But the code became mandatory in 2011. And in that period between 2011 and 2013, we had, I think, 6 or 7 total losses of nickel ore. And those were the most high profile one that set off the widespread industry awareness of nickel ore. But those shipments should not have happened, because there was no bulk cargo shipping name and there was no Section 1.3 certificate issued. We still get it quite a lot with solid biofuels, very few of which are listed in the IMSBC code, which are nevertheless shipped in bulk. And some of them are hazardous. For example, they may self-heat or they may emit flammable gases. I've already mentioned post-industrial tailings. They're all one-off cargoes. They all need individual assessment. Solid waste in bulk can also be a very wide number of cargoes, which really, unless they're specifically listed, which very few are, all need individual 1.3 certificates. An interesting one is ferrous silicon. If it has less than 25% silicon, it's not listed in the code, and therefore it needs a section 1.3 certificates, but it's quite a widespread cargo without a section 1.3 certificate, usually called group C. I mentioned mill scale already, and things like olivine sand, again, it used to be not listed, it's now listed, so that's no longer up to date. But if they're not listed in Appendix 1, they must have a section 1.3 certificate, even if everybody looking at it, the shipper, the master owners say, and surveyors say, this trade has been going on for years and years. Nobody has ever complained. It's obvious non-hazard. Just look at it. Just load it. Don't do it. You need a section 1.3 certificate. But in principle, despite all of these complications and potential disputes, the underlying framework is quite elegant and simple. Every BCSN list in the code follow the schedule. If it doesn't have a BCSN, you need a competent authority certificate. It's not a matter for shippers or owners on themselves. And there should not be disputes of cargo hazard identification if that's followed. And that takes me to the end of the more regulatory section of this particular code, and probably a good break point for any questions or discussion that may have. And I hand back over to Adam if you want to put me back on the screen.
Yeah, we've just had one question in on that section, Martin, and it refers to the bauxite fine schedule that you mentioned, which became mandatory on the 1st of January this year. And the question is just simply, have you come across any issues since then?
Yes, it's become mandatory on the 1st of January. It's been trailed for some years now with a circular, so shippers should have had several years of adapting to it. I think the particular problem with that, with the new schedule and also the previous circular, is twofold. One is the difference between the fines schedule and the lump schedule, Group A and Group C schedule, depends on particle size distribution. I will just flick back, Adam, if you could get these slides back up to the photo I had here. If it's like this, the difference between bauxite and bauxite fines is very obvious. The one on the left is obviously doesn't have any fines visible, at least there. It will never liquefy. And the one on the right doesn't have any lumps visible, so it very definitely will meet the criteria. But a lot of bauxite cargoes, especially those shipped out of West Africa, are somewhere in between. You have a lot of lumps visible, you also have a lot of fines visible, and a lot of them are shipped very wet. So if they have too many fines, they probably are too wet as well. The new code schedule requires shippers to determine the particle size distribution, and depending on the particle size distribution is either Group A or Group C. But unfortunately, it doesn't require them to give any evidence of that to the master. It's good practice for shippers, and it certainly avoids disputes on a classification if they provide that evidence to the carrier. Simply that this is the percentage of particles below 1 millimeters, this is the percentage of particles below 3.5 millimeters, and we've determined this by representative sampling in the following fashion, and particle size distribution in this way. But usually they simply say this is Group C, and then leave it to the master to ask questions. And the second problem is really one that is common for a lot of shippers of Group A cargoes, and that is that for all Group A cargoes, the Imsbc code since 2015 requires the competent authority to approve a moisture management plan, the procedures of the shippers for ensuring that the cargo has a moisture content below the TML, and the certificate of that is meant to be given to the master at loading. And in large parts of the world, it would even say the majority of shippers, the competent authorities simply do not do this, which means that this is a mandatory part of the code that for all Group A cargoes is very widely not followed. But the situation is worse for bauxite because those particular competent authorities is a new regulation. Those particular competent authorities may not know and probably don't know that they actually have to get involved for all shipments of Group A cargoes. Anything else, Adam?
Not for this section, no. So I don't know if you want to carry on with section 3 now.
Okay, I will move over to let me go back to where we were. So this is cargo, fire, and explosion hazards under the Imsbc codes. And again, it ties in with put a bit of flesh on the framework that I've just explained. There are various types of fire and explosion hazards. There are cargoes listed in the code that have identified fire and explosion hazards. That's a relatively straightforward one. You also have cargoes listed in the code, but the actual cargo given to you does have additional hazards that are not identified in the code, and there may be fire and explosion hazards. You may have cargoes maybe offered to you that are not listed in the code, and you have no idea what the hazards are unless you're given a Section 1.3 certificate by the shippers. And then a large percentage of bulk cargo fires are simply caused by factors that have nothing to do with the inherent properties of the cargo, that are external fire hazards. So, and then in each of these cases, you have, if it's listed in the code, the individual schedule will tell you what the hazards and carriage requirements are. If it's not listed in the code, that particular hazard, then really it's a shipper's obligation to tell you what the additional hazards are. And on my reading of the code, or the code is not that unambiguous on this point, each of those cargoes, if there is an additional hazard known to shippers that is not listed in the code, I think you also need a Section 1.5 certificate from the competent authority saying, yes, these additional hazards exist, and these are the additional carriage requirements to manage those hazards safely. If it's not listed in the code at all, as I said before, don't load it unless you have a Section 1.3 certificate. And then external fire hazards, these are fumigants, cargo lights, hot works, the usual causes of marine cargo fires. Some examples for each of these. There are not that many cargoes that are actually listed in the code with identified cargo fire hazards. In an earlier version of this code, this was actually a complete list. In the last two cycles of new editions, the 2018 and 2020 edition of the code, IMO have added 4 or 5 additional schedules that have fire hazards, but they're all fairly exotic cargoes that we don't encounter much. These cargoes, these 8 cargoes, are the main cargoes listed in the code, carried in bulk in reasonable volumes, that have recognized fire and explosion hazards. And for each of them, the code gives you a very specific requirement of how to carry them safely. And because it's only 8 of them, I will review them one by one, because it illustrates just how different and how cargo specific the requirements are to deal with the cargo hazards. There is no catch-all. This is what to do with fire hazards, or this is how to deal with explosion hazards in bulk cargos. Going through alphabetically, the very first one is one that has been quite high profile recently, ammonium nitrate, and it has been high profile, for example, because of this, which is the Beirut explosion last year. Now, ammonium nitrate has an explosive hazard, as you can see, and has therefore subject to a fairly elaborate set of regulations. There are 4 different grades, 4 different bulk cargo shipping names. 3 of them have UN numbers, so they're hazardous and they're hazardous whether you carry them in bulk or not. So in a container, they would still be hazardous. And they're ammonium nitrate, which is often used as explosive grade. And then there are 2 types of ammonium nitrate-based fertilizers. But there's a 4th BCSN, which is ammonium nitrate-based fertilizers, non-hazardous. And the difference between UN 2071 and the non-hazardous grade is not on chemical composition. They have exactly the same chemical composition, but it's on a particular test. The hazards of ammonium nitrate are, if you mix it with organic material, it's highly explosive. In fact, ammonium nitrate mixed with mineral oil is used as a mining explosive very widely. So bunker oil and ammonium nitrate is a very bad combination, for example. Some ammonium nitrate can self-heat. That's not that common. More common is a risk for a particular mechanism called self-sustaining decomposition, which is where when a fertilizer cargo is externally heated and starts to decompose because of heating, from that localized source, in some cargoes, it can perpetuate through the entire cargo and lead to really quite spectacular casualties that look like fires but are not fires because no oxygen is required. It's self-sustaining decomposition, no external input is required. The precautions required by the code for this hazard is the shipper need to tell you which of these schedule actually applies, and in order to do so, they need to tell you what the chemical composition is, because the classification depends on percentage of ammonium nitrate, for example, percentage of organic material and things like that. All grades of ammonium nitrate need to pass the UN tests for resistance to detonation and absence of self-heating. And in particular for the self-sustaining decomposition hazard, in order to distinguish between the 2071 and the non-hazardous grade, shippers must do prior to loading what's called a trough test. And it looks like this. You fill a sample mold like this, which is about half a meter long, exactly half a meter long, in fact, with sample of the cargo. On this end, there's a heating element, which heats it to several hundred degrees, by which you initiate decomposition at this end of the trough. And then as soon as you have established decomposition, like here, you switch off the heat source and you observe how the sample behaves. And you see here, there's a very clearly defined front for which the decomposition progresses through the length of this trough. If it stops here or here or here or anywhere along the length of the trough, it's non-hazardous. But if its decomposition continues through the entire length of the trough, this is a hazardous. This is a hazardous grade of ammonium nitrate, and it's UN 2071. The next alphabetical cargo in this list is charcoal. It's not a very common bulk cargo. It's much more common in containers, and those of you involved in the container trade and in the recent IMDG and SINS discussions will be aware that there are a lot of discussions about regulations for charcoals in containers at the moment. If you carry it in bulk, you need to have a mandatory test certificate for whether it's in UN class 4.2 self-heating, and if it is, then you must not carry it in bulk. The bulk carriage is only for non-class 4.2 cargoes. It needs to be weathered, needs to have moisture content less than 10%. But as I say, it's not a very common bulk cargo. But fires do happen. We happen to have a photo of one. This is a burning charcoal cargo. Many years ago, I wasn't personally involved, so I don't know that much more about it. Much more common, and in fact one of the most common bulk cargoes in general, and one of the most bulk cargoes that we deal with, is coal. And this is a subject for an entire talk of its own, really. But coal and brown coal briquettes have very similar regulations to coal. It has two potential hazards. It can either self-heat or it can emit methane. Shippers must tell you which of these hazards their particular cargo has. Unfortunately, in many parts of the world, bulk coal cargoes are routinely misdeclared. Virtually all, or I shouldn't say, a large percentage of Indonesian shippers, for example, simply say all of their cargoes are not liable to self-heat and not liable to emit methane, but that is very often not accurate. There's a mandatory requirement to measure oxygen, carbon monoxide, and methane throughout the voyage, and there are detailed rules of how to ventilate the cargo. If you have self-heating conditions, stop ventilating in order to deprive the cargo of oxygen. If you have a methane emitting above 20% of the lower explosive limit, you must ventilate to disperse the methane. And if in doubt, the explosion risk takes precedent over the fire risk, because fire risk is more readily manageable, whereas an explosion can be instantly catastrophic. Some example photos. This is burning coal inside a cargo hold. burning coal once it's been grabbed out of the cargo, out of the hold, and put on the quayside, where it's much easier to deal with than in the hold. And this is the aftermath of an explosion, which you can't really see it here, but those hatch covers are damaged and no longer gas tight because there was a methane explosion immediately after loading, and they're doing boundary cooling now because it's also self-heating. Cargo in the alphabetic list is DRI, and again you have three different grades. DRI is pure metallic iron in sponge form, which reacts with water and oxygen and can react at a very high reaction rate, a lot of heat generating, which means that you can get cargo fires solely from the oxidation of pure metallic iron, so rusting reaction in effect. And because it's such a high heat, the reaction can also strip oxygen from water, and that leaves hydrogen. So you can hydrogen emissions with potential explosions. There are very detailed requirements in the code for how to monitor the cargo during loading in terms of moisture content and temperature, and during the voyage in terms of the hydrogen content. DRI casualties can be really quite nasty. This is a stockpile of DRI discharged from a vessel where it had self-heated, and it's already been there for a few weeks in those stockpiles. And I didn't realize our thermocouples actually went as high as this, but this shows 604 degrees in that particular stockpile. So quite a tricky cargo to carry in many ways. Then we have a whole group of different cargoes, which are the main one of which is ferrosilicon, which is the most dangerous, most hazardous one, has the longest set of special requirements in the code, but quite similar in properties. You have ferrophosphorus, silicon, manganese, and then these are relatively newly introduced, but behave much the same as well. So these are ferrous alloys in lump form that, when they get wet, can emit hydrogen and two toxic gases, phosphine and arsine. And all of them need to be carried with continuous mechanical ventilation and need to be stored under cover but exposed to air for 3 days prior to loading, and that needs to be certified by the shippers. Ferrosilicon also needs to have an inspection of the engine room bulkhead, and all of them will require gas monitoring. Precisely gases of which need to be monitored depend on which particular one it is. I've already touched on it briefly before. There's one particular pitfall in this. There are these particular 7 BCSNs, but one of the more common grades of ferrosilicon shipped is actually ferrosilicon with less than 25% silicon. And there's a particular logical flaw that some shippers make, possibly because they haven't quite understood the mechanism of the Imsbc code I've just discussed in this talk, which is we have a schedule with a UN number for ferrosilicon above 30% silicon. We have an MHB schedule, which is still group B, but doesn't have a UN number if it's between 25 and 30% silicon, but there's no schedule for less than 25% silicon. And a fairly natural conclusion from that to draw from that is that must be non-hazardous. And that may well be correct, but it's not something for the shippers to decide. It's not a listed cargo. It needs a Section 143 certificate from the competent authority. So if a shipper offers a ferrosilicon cargo with less than 25% silicon as Group C, it should not be loaded unless there's also a Section 143 certificate accompanying it. Next cargo alphabetically is ferrous metal borings, shavings, turnings, and cuttings. It's basically scrap that in finely divided form that can self-heat. Also may have some lubricants that assist that oil and grease contamination. And there are certain requirements, but it's really down to the shippers to self-certify. If the shipper says, no, this cargo doesn't have self-heating properties, then it can be carried as scrap, which is a Group C cargo. Fish meal, I won't say very much about it. It can be self-heat by oxidation. Was a big problem in the 1990s, mostly in bagged form, but also sometimes in bulk. We haven't had many problems lately, touch wood, but it does have a requirement for antioxidant treatment prior to loading and certification of moisture, oil, and temperature. And then moving on, and the last one alphabetically here is seed cake. Now, seed cake is has just undergone quite a big revision in the Imsbc code requirements since the 2020 edition, which I've highlighted here in red. The hazard here, these seed cakes are basically all the cargoes that are produced by extracting oil from edible seeds and various other plant material, with the residue then being used as animal feed. And the hazard generally is that it can it can self-heat first by microbiological self-heating with shipped to wet, and then later by oxidative self-heating, of the oil, which can lead to fires. Which is why that there are various grades of seed cake depending on the oil content, and there used to be a single category seed cake non-hazardous, which are all the seed cakes that are specifically exempt in the code because they're not one of those. That has recently been replaced by two new schedules. One of them is seed cakes and other residues, MHB, material hazard in bulk. Still Group B cargo, virtually everything that applies to these cargoes also applies to that particular BCSN, but it's MHB rather than UN number. And then there is the non-hazardous Group C cargo, which is the same ones as here, but ones that aren't liable to self-heat. The new introduction in the 2020 code is that now there's a mandatory UN self-heating tests for all seed cake cargoes. Shippers can only declare their particular seed cake, and that includes some very high volume seed cakes, such as soybean meal, if they first do a UN self-heating test. Now, certain requirements for seed cake cargoes: you need a preloading certificate of moisture and oil. You need UN self-heating test now, an insulated engine room bulkhead, and you can only carry it if the cargo temperature is below 55 degrees at loading and during the voyage. And if it's the Group B type, you also need inert gas facilities for most voyages. An example: this is corn gluten feed, which is not actually on fire yet, but was on fire a few hours later. And this particular example illustrates why there was the need to introduce a self-heating test, because I showed you before a UN Coast Guard certificate for under section 1.5 for corn gluten feed. This is the very cargo for which this particular section 1.5 certificate was issued, and it was on board of this ship, that certificate, but it self-heated and spontaneously combusted. So clearly something went wrong here. And what went wrong is that the UN Coast Guard had issued a section 1.5 certificate because the cargo wasn't self-heating enough to meet the UN requirements for the UN number, but it was self-heating enough to cause fire in bulk. So this is the classic material hazards only in bulk cargo. And that is why this new UN requirement for the UN self-heating test was just introduced. Won't go into detail on these diagrams. I've stole them shamelessly from an article that my colleague Daniel Sheard published earlier this year, which is available from our website. So if you want to know more about the new seed cake regulations, go to the news section on our website, download Daniel's article. It's very good. So these are the listed hazards in the code for fire and explosion. Now, I went through that in some detail specifically because I think it illustrates that they're all very different. Each individual cargo with fire and explosion hazards has its own specific certification requirements and preloading precautions that are tailor-made for that particular hazard, which means that if you have additional hazards, you need similar level of guidance from the shippers, from the common authority to carry it. But unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. Here are some recent examples. So if you have non-identified hazards, particularly dangerous, but because the master would not necessarily know that there's a breach of code, that there is an additional hazard, the shipper has to tell him, or her for that matter. On my reading of the code, although it, as I said, it's not necessarily very clear from reading the code, if there is an additional hazard which takes it out of the scope of the existing schedule, then there needs to be a section 1.5 certificate from the competent authority as well. And if you don't have that, then it simply cannot be carried safely under the code, because you don't know, or the master doesn't know, what they need to do in order to deal with that particular hazard. We have some recent examples here. There's some uncalcined pet coke loaded in Venezuela, which turned out to be self-heating and had a cargo fire loading. And when it was tried to manage that cargo fire by excluding oxygen, the flammable gas levels shot through the roof. So you had to open up again because there were residual hydrocarbons in this cargo. So even though the hazards look similar to those of coal, it actually didn't behave like coal. And you couldn't just assume, treat it like coal and carry it. You do need to have specific safety requirements. There's also wood pellets, which are listed in the code, but are not listed as a self-heating and cargo fire hazards, but unfortunately they can. Under certain circumstances, some cargoes have been known to cause cargo fire. This is a cargo being discharged very close to home to us and burning, obviously, as you can see. And then you have the broader category, unlisted cargoes. And I've said before, don't assume because a shipper tells you and because you think it's common sense and non-hazardous that it actually is non-hazardous. If it's not listed, you need a section 1.3 certificate. And the reason for that is that the hazards may be non-intuitive, or even shippers may not know them. And we had two recent examples. They're both unlisted cargoes. I think the trades are still going on. Shippers declared in both instances them as Group C. One is palm kernel shells loaded in Indonesia, which is used as a solid biofuel, as a byproduct of the palm oil industry. And it was loaded wet because the buyers didn't care whether it was wet. It was just a fuel. And the shippers didn't want to build warehouses. And as soon as it was loaded, it became obvious that it was emitting large levels of gas. And once we measured what those levels are, it turned out that it was methane. And indeed, at one stage, we had 40% by volume of methane in the headspaces, which is basically a floating bomb. In order to deal with this, we had to purge the headspaces, and we had several of these cargoes, with nitrogen to bring it below the lower explosive limit, so the hatch caps can be safely opened for discharge. Really quite a nasty hazard for something that was given to the vessel as a Group C cargo, non-hazardous, no special requirements for carriage. But there was no listing in the code, and there was no section 1.3 certificate. Now you think this may happen. This may happen only in certain jurisdictions, and it's true that Indonesia has a certain reputation for I mentioned coal. We have nickel ore as well, but unfortunately, very similar instances can happen in Western European highly developed countries. There was another recent incident very close to home. I won't go into details of what it is, but readers of investigation reports may already have identified it, loading incinerator ash from a household waste incinerator. We declared as Group C cargo. There was no schedule in the Imsbc code and no section 1.3 certificate. And it turned out that within a few hours of loading, that this cargo was emitting hydrogen. There was an explosion at anchorage, blowing the hatch covers open, and there was a serious injury. Luckily, no fatality. But it illustrates that it's not something they can say, these are notorious jurisdiction, or be careful when you load in a particular part of the world. It's a requirement, and you need to be careful and cautious wherever you load in the world. But then also, bulk cargoes can be exposed to external fire hazards. And classical examples are things like buried cargo lamps or hot work. In things like grain, they cause smoldering fires. In certain cargoes, I have an example of cocoa beans. I'll show you a photo in a second. Cargoes may spread, even though they start localized and start smoldering, because in cocoa beans you have the cocoa butter can melt and then becomes a carpet of fire. The other photos from burning cocoa bean cargo from a buried cargo fan, with a fumigant fan, we believe. And it spread, it ran down, melting fat ran down this bulkhead, spread over the tank top, and there was a burning carpet all over the tank top. And then you get fumigant fires and explosion from phosphine in. But these are examples that are really not covered by the Imsbc code as such, because in this case the hazard isn't inherent to the cargo, but it's external to the cargo. In general, if you're dealing with bulk cargos, whether hazardous or not, follow the Imsbc code. So the summary or the takeaway message from this particular talk is the Imsbc code is mandatory for all bulk cargos except grain. You must get the bulk cargo shipping name from the shipper prior to loading, because that is the way to identify what bulk hazards and precautions are required for this particular cargo. If there isn't a bulk cargo shipping name, you need a section 1.3 certificate from competent authority. If the cargo isn't as described in the Imsbc code, but had additional hazards or fewer hazards for that matter than in the code, you also need a certificate from competent authority under section 1.5. And as far as fire and explosion hazards are concerned, each individual bulk cargo that has a hazard like this has very specific cargo-specific pre-loading testing and certification requirements, which you need to establish prior to loading, and ventilation or gas monitoring requirement during the voyage. But if in doubt, follow the code and it will save you safe too. Thank you very much. Back to Adam.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, there's been a couple of questions coming in, so just conscious of time. So if we keep the answers succinct, Martin, and then we'll get through them all. So quite a few refer to section 1.3 and also the BCSN. So if we deal with section 1.3 first, how do you know if the certificate is issued by a competent authority?
Well, the competent authority, there is a list of competent authorities in the Imsbc code, and they're generally the ministries of shipping or the Coast Guard or the maritime safety authorities of the country of loading. It's quite important. It's not the harbour master of the port of loading, which may well be very closely related to the shippers, but it is the National Maritime Safety Agency. The list in the Imsbc code is not quite complete. For example, there's none listed for Indonesia, but there is actually a competent authority even in places like even in Indonesia, and there are different lists where they are established. But it's not self-certifying by the shipper, and it's not the local port authority or harbour master that issues that. It's a central government agency as nominated by the government to IMO.
Okay. And then also about liquefaction with the BCSN cargoes and section 1.3. So if a cargo has the potential to liquefy but has no BCSN, how many tri-party agreements, as in 1.3, have you seen actually achieved?
Very few is the answer. It's a requirement of the code that if the cargo is anything other than non-hazardous, as assessed by the competent authority of the loading country, that the competent authority needs to speak to the flag state and to the country of discharge before issuing their section 1.3 certificate. I think I may have seen 2, if I think about it, but in both instances, this followed protracted discussions and disputes between countries. I correct myself. There was one for DRIC I saw recently that was issued before the ship actually arrived. So that's, I think, the only non-contentious one that I can think of.
Okay, just sticking with the bulk cargo shipping name for a second. Are there any guidelines to follow to determine the BCSN of the commodity?
No, there isn't, which is unfortunate. There is a section. Each schedule has a section on description, which, not terribly helpfully, is actually listed in the code as non-mandatory and only advisory or informative. But that gives you a clue of what cargoes IMO intended to be covered by that particular schedule. But as I say, there is no mechanism by which a shipper can decide this is a heap of cargo that I want to put onto this ship. These are the steps I need to go through in order to decide from the characteristics and the nature of that cargo. That's the bulk cargo shipping name. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. Now, as I said in the talk, unfortunately, in some instances, shippers, either through ignorance or through a desire to ship something that they know they shouldn't ship, have come up with inappropriate bulk cargo shipping names that don't actually describe the cargo hazards and the nature of the cargo very well.
Okay. So if somebody is loading a solid bulk cargo under Imsbc code, do they need to refer to the grain code?
It's either listed. Grain covers all cargoes such as cereal grains in narrow sense and oil seeds, so soya beans, rapeseed, and the like. Also cocoa beans, and whole unprocessed crops. So they are not covered by the Imsbc code at all. It's either covered by the grain code or the Imsbc code. All grain code cargoes are assumed to be non-hazardous for as defined in the Imsbc code. They're not MHB, and don't have UN number. But the grain code is mainly concerned with trimming and stability. There are some Imsbc code cargoes that are free flowing enough that also have the same stability concerns, and some fertilizers in particular. So whenever the angle of repose is, I think, below, I can't quite remember, 30 or 25 degrees, then the grain code applies to that cargo, even though the Imsbc code applies as well. That's mostly for certain types of fertilizers. So then you need to follow the SOLAS and the grain code stability requirements in terms of trimming, in terms of stability handbook and the like.
Okay, so just two more to go. So shippers are obliged to declare. However, if they don't declare, what can the ship and the master, the owner, or the affected parties do?
Well, that's probably a question more for P&I clubs and lawyers. It means that the shippers are in breach of the code, and that now I am not a P&I specialist, but my understanding of club rules means that probably will invalidate cover as well. So it's probably a good idea to speak to your club and escalate this. Okay,
and just one final one. This is quite a long one. What are procedures for the bulk cargoes listed in the code but shipped in package form, i.e. ammonium nitrate, shipped in 1 to 2 ton bags, and how such cargo should be treated as if it falls under general goods? And also some of the cargoes are not listed in the IMDG, so it becomes challenging to determine the hazards or properties when misdeclared.
Yeah. This is a particularly tricky area. As I said, if it does have a UN number, then it's also listed in the IMDG code, and the requirements in the IMDG code, which apply when it's in packaged form, including in big bags, will be closely aligned to the Imsbc code requirements in general. Anyway, where it becomes tricky is if it's an MHB cargo, material hazards only in bulk, because that is not listed in the Imsbc code, in the IMDG code, sorry. And in principle, a shipper would be entitled to simply put their hazardous bulk cargo into big bags, stack it into your ship, and say it's now a non-hazardous cargo. But realistically, in big bags, it will still have exactly the same hazards as they have in bulk. So even though it's not covered by either the IMDG code or the Imsbc code, I would consider it's good practice to follow the requirements of the Imsbc code voluntarily for those cargoes.
Okay, that's great. I think that concludes the Q&A and therefore concludes the session. So thank you very much, Martin, for that presentation. I hope everybody that attended found it useful. Thank you all for joining. The presentation will be uploaded to our YouTube channel later on today, so if you need a recap or forward it to anybody that wasn't available to join us today, then please do so. And we look forward to seeing you all again in the future. Thanks for joining us.